Georges Gaussat was born in 1863 into an affluent family in Périgueux in the southwest of France. His father died when George was 21, and the wealth he inherited meant he had no need to earn a living. But in 1888 he self-published 3 albums of caricatures, and that's when he began using the alias Sem. In 1890 he settled in Bordeaux, but during this period he travelled regularly to Paris and began having his work published in magazines and occasionally as posters. After a brief spell in Marseille, he relocated to Paris in 1900, and he remained there for the rest of his life. A couple of months after his arrival, he published an album of drawings with a horse racing theme titled Le Turf, and it was an instant popular success among prominent Parisian socialites, including those he actually made fun of in the images. In October of the same year he published another titled Paris Trouville, and it was just as successful as the first. By now something of a celebrity himself, he created another 9 volumes up to 1913, and as well as his ongoing appearances in Paris's humour magazines, he also became a popular choice to create posters, quite a few of them for alcohol. Gaussat was already 50 years old when the war began and therefore not expected to fight, but he played his part as a war correspondent for Le Journal. He produced 2 albums of war sketches in a style not used for his other work, and he also created posters to promote the sale of war bonds. Following the end of the war, Gaussat carried on as before, and the exuberant frivolity of what in France was known as les années folles gave him plenty of material for his good-natured satires. Where some of his contemporaries had struggled to address the immense shift in social behaviour following the war, Gaussat straddled the 2 eras with great success. His collections of drawings continued to sell in large numbers, and in 1927 he published the album White Bottoms, which focused on the dance craze known as the Black Bottom, sweeping the Parisian cabaret and jazz clubs. This was a particularly amusing visual account of the French elite's frequently less than accomplished attempts to master the dance moves introduced by the black American performers who were taking Europe by storm with the energy of their music. But this collection will be among his last projects, and following a heart attack, Georges Gaussat died in Paris in 1934 at the age of 71. Maxwell Armfield was born into a Quaker family in the county of Hampshire in England in 1881. In 1897, at only 16 years old, he began to study at Birmingham's School of Art. Although he hadn't been comfortable with the formal teaching there, in 1902 he moved to Paris to study at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, and in 1904 he exhibited at the Paris Salon. And it seems that at this time, and for the next few years, illustration wasn't part of his ambitions. But in 1909 he married the writer Constance Smedley, and it was at this point that Armfield's career as an illustrator began. He collaborated with his wife on The Flower Book, which was published in 1910. She wrote the text and he provided a series of naturalistic-like watercolour depictions of the various species of flora featured. This would have been something of a decisive year for Armfield's career, because it was also in 1910 that his beautifully illustrated edition of the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen was published. This was a lavishly produced gift book featuring many full-page delicate line and wash illustrations, and it was a well-deserved critical and popular success. The volume of illustration was a significant achievement in itself, but as if making up for lost time, he also published a similarly exquisite series of watercolours for the French medieval romantic tale of Aucassin and Nicolette. And Armfield's illustrations were rightly considered to have played a major part in this edition's popularity. In 1912 he illustrated Cambridge and its history with yet more watercolours of idyllic views of the historic architecture and agreeable scenery to be found in the city. And up to this point Armfield appeared to be defined as an illustrator by this type of work. But in 1914 he published a book of his own poems, illustrated with a rather unexpected series of modernist line and flat colour illustrations. And following this demonstration of graphic versatility, in 1915 he also created a pair of stylish and equally modernist posters for the London Underground. It was also in that year that his collaboration with the writer Vernon Lee, titled The Ballet of the Nations, was published. This was a clearly pacifist piece of satirical work using ancient Greek motifs to reflect on the evils of war, a subject firmly embedded in Armfield's Quaker faith. But the fiercely patriotic mood which prevailed in wartime England was at odds with his point of view, and a hostile reaction to the book and his stance led to the Armfields leaving Britain for the USA. The couple spent the next 7 years travelling around various American states, while he drew and painted along the way. Many of these images were later published as a book, but its limited appeal was never going to make it a popular volume. They returned to England in 1922, and in that year they published another collaboration, the Armfields Animal Book, with images leaning heavily towards the kind of folk art he'd become fascinated by while resident in New Mexico. In the later 20s and into the 1930s, evidence of his illustration and art become rather thin on the ground. But there is evidence that he worked successfully as a textile designer, combining folk art and Art Deco elements in his designs. Constance Smedley died in 1941 at the age of 65, but Maxwell Armfield still had some way to go and didn't die until 1972, when he was 91 years old. British children's illustrator Ernest Harris must be one of the most poorly remembered of his generation, and I can't imagine why this should be. He was born in London in 1882, but in his youth the family moved to Bradford in West Yorkshire, and he subsequently studied at the City's Art School. Following this, he returned to London to attend the Royal College of Art, and then began a career as an artist, with which he enjoyed reasonable success. The earliest examples of illustration work I've found date from 1903 and are in the form of postcards, some of which were intended to be humorous and others which were scenic in nature. But it isn't until 1909 that book illustration by Harris begins to appear, and the evidence clearly shows that in the intervening years his technique had improved dramatically. Although on occasion he produced line-only monochromes, the great majority of his output was created and printed in full colour. Virtually all his illustrations were of endearing anthropomorphised animal characters, created with extremely accomplished and expressive pen line and tonal watercolour washes. Not only was Harris a talented illustrator, but he wrote many of the stories too, and his books sold in large numbers, delighting young children with the antics of his repertory company of woodland creatures. But although children's book work undoubtedly constituted the backbone of his career, in 1915 he also created a series of very attractive wildlife-themed watercolours, which were used as posters by London Transport. During the years of the Great War, he was approached by Beatrix Potter's publisher to ask if he would take over the illustration of her books, as her eyesight was at this point rapidly deteriorating. But although he would have made an ideal replacement, the proposal ultimately came to nothing. In 1917, Harris published his own book, The Treasure Seekers, which featured a character by the name of Peter Rabbit, and consequently various lawsuits were issued by Potter's legal representatives. For reasons I can't work out, this unresolved dispute led to Harris changing publishers and adopting the pseudonyms Robin A. Hood and Dan Crow. But this didn't last long, and not many years later he returned to using his own name, and the immense volume of books he created in the 1920s and 1930s clearly indicates his reputation hadn't suffered any lasting damage. In 1934 he designed a range of animal characters for Cadbury's Cocoa. These metal cast figurines were known as the Cocoa Cubs, and they were very popular and avidly collected by British children. And in the mid-1930s, in addition to his own books, he became one of the select group of illustrators to create illustrations for books written by Britain's most popular author, Enid Blyton. His popularity as both author and illustrator continued throughout the Second World War and the years which followed, and in 1947 he illustrated the first in a highly successful series known as Tassel-Tip Tales, written by Dorothy Richards. In later years he also began producing illustrations for children's comics and magazines, such as this example from 1955. Ernest Harris died in London in 1963 when he was 81 years old, and he's been greatly neglected ever since. Cardwell Higgins was born in East Orange, New Jersey in 1902 and enrolled at the National Academy of Design at 18. But he found their teaching too formal and moved not long after to the more progressive Art Students League. After graduation, Higgins started work at a New York engraving firm, but in the later 1920s he moved out to California and worked alongside luminaries including Alberto Vargas and Henry Clive as an illustrator for Paramount Pictures. There his creations included stylized portraits of various movie stars for the film company's publicity material, press ads and posters. After developing his technique with Paramount, he returned to New York in the early 1930s, where he began the most productive period of his career as a freelance illustrator. He created many nude and provocatively half-dressed pin-up covers for several of the racier pulp magazines of the time, and he evidently enjoyed producing these brazenly erotic females to entice the male readers into discovering the salacious stories within. But this wasn't his only arena, and he was simultaneously producing other illustrations and advertising work, including publicity for the New York World's Fair of 1939 and for Cadillac cars. The advertising campaign he created for Coney Island's Palisades Park made great use of his prowess as a pin-up artist, with a cheerful bathing beauty character who featured in all their promotion. And alongside his ongoing advertising and pulp illustration, there is this single piece of visual evidence that he also worked in comic book. When America entered World War II, he taught camouflage design for the army, and also illustrated this determinedly upbeat patriotic poster urging American women to knit a sweater for a soldier. After the war, Higgins was less prolific, and he seems to have been more focused on illustrating magazine fiction, mostly of a fairly lurid nature. But he also spent some time teaching art and worked sporadically as a freelance designer and art director, including design work for Eastern Airlines. In the later 1960s he retired from commercial activity, although in the 70s he recreated some of his earlier monochrome work in a very attractive blend of neoclassical and Art Deco styling. And Cardwell Higgins died in 1983 at the age of 81. So that's it for now, and I hope I'll see you when the next one is ready to go.